Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, Lord's Amendment 4, which seeks to protect leaseholders and tenants from paying for the remediation of unsafe cladding from their building. I recognise also that a number of alternative amendments have been tabled, and I expect we'll hear a number of views during the debate on this particular issue, and I intend to respond at the end of the debate to those interventions, given the nature that many of the interventions will be virtual. First, I should state that we agree with the intent to give leaseholders peace of mind and financial certainty. That's why the Government has recently announced it will be providing an additional £3.5 billion to fund the removal and replacement of unsafe cladding targeted at the highest risk buildings. This brings the total investment in building safety to an unprecedented £5 billion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm glad that the Minister's confirmed the extra £3.5 billion into this, bringing the total to £5 billion. So therefore, will the Minister confirm that this means that will fully cost the removal of cladding and that those leaseholders that live in high-rise buildings won't have to foot the bill?
Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is the case. And I know that my MHCLG colleagues, ministers, have been in this place and debated this extensively. Having made the case to Treasury, it was very gratifying to see this money come forward, which will assist in particular those who are living in fear in high-rise buildings, but also those in mid-rise buildings as well, who, as I'm sure my honourable friend knows, will benefit from a financing scheme.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Unfortunately, leaseholders in my constituency in Cardiff South and Penarth have been left in the dark after that announcement the other day, because despite the cooperation between the Welsh Government and the UK Government, the Minister will know around this bill and the details in it, they've been unable to get answers on the crucial issue of how the building development levy, the new tax, and whether there will be any new money for Wales in the proposals laid out by the Secretary of State the other day. Would he urgently respond to the letter from the Welsh Housing Minister, Julie James, asking very reasonable questions and setting out constructive solutions? And would he and his MHCLG colleagues meet with me to discuss these issues and find a solution for leaseholders across the United Kingdom?
Minister.
So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I understand the honourable gentleman's impatience, and it's shared by all of us across this House. The scheme is in development, as I understand it, at MHCLG, and I know that ministers are working very hard to get the basis and the foundations and the system in place to get that money distributed as quickly as possible. Happily, in terms of high-rise buildings, I think we're well over 90% now that are either remediated or in the process of being remediated. But I completely agree with him that we need to work with all urgency to bring as much possible relief, if you like, from the stress of living with this cladding in the future. And I'll certainly ask my colleagues at MHCLG to consider his offer of a useful meeting. I know they will be responding to correspondence from the Welsh Government as quickly as possible. By all means.
Thank you. I think we all recognise the frustration exhibited by the member for Cardiff, and it's shared across this House. And perhaps the Minister could explain what steps the Government is taking to make sure that the construction industry pays its fair share in the remediation and the future prevention of risk.
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. As members who perhaps been in the House a little longer than him will know, I was Housing Minister for a brief period, 12 months, about 18 months ago. And the work started then of sitting alongside the construction industry, both to get them to stand up and fulfil their obligations to the people who were living in defective high-rise buildings in particular, and a number of them did. And working with them, through Treasury Bays and MHCLG, I know that there is a new atmosphere abroad, if you like, and that's certainly part of the challenge that we face. It's not just about the regulation that we're putting in place today, it's also about a cultural change in the industry towards building safety, and that they are now full partners in facing this challenge for the future. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, government funding does not absolve building owners of their responsibility to ensure their buildings are safe. We have been clear that building owners and the industry, as the honourable gentleman has just said, should make buildings safe without passing on costs to leaseholders. They should consider all routes to meet costs, for example, through warranties and recovering costs from contractors for incorrect poor work. We've always been clear that all residents deserve to be and feel safe in their homes. We're working at pace to ensure remediation of unsafe cladding is completed, and we've an ambitious timescale to do so. And as I said earlier, about 95% of high-rise buildings with Grenfell-type ACM cladding identified at the start of 2020 have completed remediation or had works on site by the end of last year. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm afraid the Fire Safety Bill is not the correct place for remediation costs to be addressed. It is a short but critical bill to clarify that the fire safety order applies to the external walls, including cladding and flat entrance doors in multi-occupied residential buildings. This means the responsible person must include these parts of the building in their fire risk assessment. This does not include the remediation of historic defects. It does not have the necessary legislative detail that would be needed to underpin these amendments in regulations. The Building Safety Bill is the appropriate legislative mechanism for addressing these issues, and it will be introduced in the spring. It will contain the detailed and complex legislation that is needed to address remediation costs.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Does he believe that by incorporating these amendments it may delay the bill and actually mean that we can't execute on the measures in this bill right now?
I'm afraid that is the fundamental risk that we face at the moment. We want to get this bill on the statute book as quickly as possible. It forms the starting block, if you like, of a complex web of legislation and regulation that is required to bring about the changes in building safety across the whole of the country. And I hope that members do recognise that the potential delay that may be inserted by back and forth between the houses over this particular issue is not useful. And as I say, this issue should be debated in the Building Safety Bill, which is coming forward shortly, and I know that members will embrace that particular piece of legislation to do so. If I just make a little bit of progress, if I may, just to outline why. These amendments, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm afraid aren't sufficiently clear or detailed to deliver on what members say they wish to achieve. The amendments would require extensive drafting in primary legislation, thereby delaying the implementation, as we've just discussed, of the Fire Safety Bill and the crucial measures it puts forward to improve the fire safety regulatory system. They would also be impractical. For example, in cases where it would be difficult to identify whether a risk has materialised from wear or tear or due to a building safety defect. Also, stating what the landlord can and cannot recover from leaseholders may well contradict the provisions set out in the contractual terms of a lease. It would be unclear where these costs should lie, rather than being determined by the terms of the lease. These might result in crucial interim measures to protect residents while remediation is being brought forward being delayed, meaning fire and rescue services would have no choice but to evacuate residents. Additionally, the new clauses, though well-intentioned, would not always protect leaseholders from all remediation costs. They only apply to defects uncovered through a fire risk assessment, but not, for example, to defects discovered as a result of an incident or indeed other works taking place. Now, members will be aware that we will soon be bringing forward, as I have said, the Building Safety Bill to Parliament, which is a once-in-a-generation change to the building safety regime. This will bring about fundamental change in both the regulatory framework for building safety and the construction industry culture, creating a more accountable system to ensure a tragedy like Grenfell can never happen again.
I'm very grateful, and for all the work he did as Housing Minister to resolve this issue. We met on many occasions to discuss it. Does he also agree that this amendment or new clause is self-defeating, in that it puts the onus for any fire safety work back onto the owner? And that owner, given that debt or that cost that work, if it's left with, will simply walk away. That's what will happen. These owners have probably paid a few £1,000s per flat to rights to collect ground rent. If you put a debt on them of £40,000 per flat, they will simply walk away. And who will carry the can then for the work?
Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman speaks with some expertise in this area, and I know he's been a constant presence in debates on this matter over the last few years. And he is right. Given the number of, for example, freeholds that are held in limited liability vehicles, which could, in the position he points out, simply put themselves into some kind of insolvency procedure, would mean that it is self-defeating. And that's why any measure along these lines would need to be scrutinised carefully and thought about perhaps in a little more detail before we bring it in. Alongside that, Madam Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, for Housing Communities of Local Government has committed to taking decisive action to end the cladding scandal once and for all through the government's 5-point plan to provide reassurance to homeowners and build confidence in the housing market. Funding will be targeted at the highest risk buildings in line with long-standing independent expert advice and evidence. Lower-rise buildings with a lower risk to safety will gain new protection from the costs of cladding removal through a long-term, low-interest government-backed financing scheme. The government is also committed to making sure no leaseholder in these buildings will pay more than £50 per month towards this remediation. But let me be clear, it is unacceptable for leaseholders to have to worry about the cost of fixing historic safety defects in their buildings. I do ask that honourable members recognise that while these amendments are based on good intentions, they are not the appropriate means to solve these complex problems. By providing unprecedented funding and a generous financing scheme, we're ensuring that money is available for remediation, accelerating the process and making homes safer as quickly as possible. And you have my assurance, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the government schemes to address these issues will be launched as a matter of priority, and that we will provide an update on the underpinning details, as the honourable gentleman urged us to do, as soon as we are in a position to do so. For the reasons set out, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope that the House will see fit to support me in my aspirations with regard to these and other amendments.
The question is that this House agrees with the Lords in their Amendment 1. Sarah James.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Policing Minister, and I would also like to put on record my best wishes to the Right Honourable Member for Old Bexley and Sidcup, who cannot be here to lead from government today. We all wish him a speedy recovery. I want to thank our Fire and Rescue Service, who are going above and beyond to keep us safe and have worked tirelessly to protect us throughout the COVID pandemic. I'm grateful to ministers, to officials and to House staff who have worked with us on this bill, and I give particular thanks to Johanna Solberg and Kenneth Fox, who have supported me in particular through the bill. Thanks to Lord Kennedy of Southwark and all the Lords who have led this bill through the House of Lords and ensured that Labour's key amendment on implementing the Grenfell Phase 1 recommendations passed in the Lords. Madam Deputy Speaker, every time we debate and discuss the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire, we hold the memory of those who died in our hands. We must be gentle and respectful, but we must also see the injustice and honour those who died by taking action, by not resting until justice is done, until everybody has a safe home that they can afford. I must pay tribute to the campaigners, Grenfell United, the families, survivors and entire community for their tireless fight for justice. And to the campaigners who every day are fighting for the hundreds of thousands of people trapped in unsafe buildings, people who face extortionate bills, unable to move. The drumbeat of their lives is fear and anxiety. No Parliament can ignore that. There are thousands of people working on this, but I want to particularly thank Ritu and Will from UK Cladding Action Group for their assiduous efforts. And I want to thank the 200 people who joined our roundtable this morning so that we could hear firsthand the horrors that this government is willfully enabling. As Ritu said, we are fellow human beings in these buildings, your family, your friends, your colleagues. To everyone who is affected, who is living in fear and anxiety, I am sorry. We must do better. As we've said throughout the passage of this bill, we support the bill. But it is very small, and it is the only piece of concrete legislation we've had since Grenfell. That is not an adequate response to the biggest housing safety crisis in a generation. It does not even scratch the surface of the work that must be done to fix the wild west of building control and fire safety that we have seen played out with such horror over the past few weeks of the Grenfell Inquiry Phase 2. It has taken so long to get here, and at every stage we've had to drag this government into action. The government promised to act swiftly after Grenfell, but it took them almost 3 years to introduce the Fire Safety Bill. We've waited 12 weeks just for them to bring the bill back to consider Lord's amendments. The Fire Safety Bill is intended to be a foundational bill. Its purpose is to provide clarity on what's covered under the Fire Safety Order, which will inform other related and secondary legislation. At committee stage, the Minister said that the government intends to legislate further and spoke many times of action still to come, as he did today. But by this stage, Madam Deputy Speaker, we need more than vague commitments about secondary legislation. At the very least, we need a clear timetable from government that sets out when further changes of the regulatory reform fire safety order will be delivered, when secondary legislation will be introduced, when the bill will be implemented. In response to a deeply frustrated letter from Grenfell survivors in September, the government said that the introduction of the fire safety bill was a key priority, and yet the bill doesn't include provisions for any of the measures called for by the first phase of the Grenfell inquiry. There are many issues around improving fire safety that we would like to see included in this bill. However, now, many will have to be introduced through the draft building safety bill and secondary legislation, and we have no idea when any of those things will actually happen. And I will give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. I've been asked by my party leader here, Geoffrey Donaldson, the member for Lagan Valley, and other members who have relatives who own these flats on the mainland. They have extreme concerns. They have the fear that the Honourable Lady has referred to about the properties and what that means for the future. While government are good intentions, I believe, and I think the Honourable Lady also believes, that they're not going far enough. Could you confirm that, is she convinced, is the Honourable Lady convinced by what the Minister has said? And if not, will the Honourable Lady put this to a vote tonight?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman, thank you for his intervention, and I do not think the government has gone far enough. I am not accepting of the reasons why we are going at such a snail's pace on something so important, and I will come to what we think should be done about it. The government rejected many attempts to amend the bill. The draft building safety bill places various requirements on what's called the responsible person and refers to the fire safety order for the definition of that. But the fire safety order doesn't provide a definition of the responsible person. The draft building safety bill even attempts to put into law a building safety charge. It's vital that the fire safety order makes it clear that there's no ambiguity around the definition of responsible person, and it doesn't mean leaseholders. However, the government chose to reject that amendment. The fire safety order requires regular fire risk assessments in buildings, but it includes no legal requirement for those conducting the assessment to have any form of training or accreditation. At committee and report stage, we tabled amendments that would bring into force an accreditation system for fire risk assessors rather than waiting for more secondary legislation. We also tabled an amendment to require the schedule for inspecting buildings to be based on a prioritisation of risk, not an arbitrary distinction of types and heights of building. And on that point, I'm glad that the government has listened, having turned us down in the initial stages and taken good practice from Croydon and others and introduced a risk-based approach into this bill. We tabled an amendment on Waking Watch to require the government to specify when and for how long such measures should take place. And thanks to Lord Kennedy of Southwark, our amendment on implementing key measures from the first phase of the Grenfell inquiry did pass in the Lords, despite the government's attempts to block it. The government has made so many promises to address the fire safety crisis, but failed to keep them. The families and survivors are still waiting for justice, and hundreds of thousands of leaseholders and tenants are still trapped. Madam Deputy Speaker, this afternoon, as we debate the Lords' amendments, the government faces a choice on what they could include in this bill. They could do the right thing and fulfil their promises, or they could push the can down the road again. We do care, just not quite enough, not quite yet. There are two answers that thousands of people across the country are watching and waiting for today. Will the government change their mind and back the Lords' amendment to implement recommendations from the Grenfell inquiry? And will the government legislate to ensure leaseholders, blameless victims of this crisis, do not have to foot the bill for measures to make their buildings safe? Turning to Lords' amendment number 2. Yes.
Although I can understand the point behind her position, and I assume she's going to vote for the Lords Amendment 4. Can she answer the point I made to the Minister on duty today? What will she do when the building owners simply walk away? Well, where will the costs go? Has she got a solution for that? Does she not accept, actually, this amendment is fundamentally flawed? It is not the right way to achieve what she wants to achieve.
Sarah Jones. Can I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, and he is an expert in this area, and I very much respect what he says. I think the answer is that it is for the government to resolve this crisis. It is not for leaseholders to foot the bill. And through a national task force, which is what we suggested, so that you could address the problem at, the government could take responsibility for finding the costs and the remediation work, and then find out who is responsible in the same way that you would say the polluter pays principle. You could get to the point where people who were responsible for the problem were paying the bill. But the fundamental point that we are trying to achieve here, and the Minister said there were flaws in the way the amendment was worded, he could have amended it, is to say there has to be a principle that those who are least able to afford to pay are the ones who frankly, in law at the moment, are the only ones that have to pay. Turning, if I can, to Lord's Amendment 2 in more detail, Madam Deputy Speaker, it would place robust requirements on building owners or managers and implement the key recommendations from Phase 1 of the Grenfell inquiry. The Minister said in his contribution that he had concerns with the way it was worded. Again, the government could have tried to amend it themselves and fix some of these problems along the way, but have chosen not to. The government said they would implement the Grenfell Phase 1 inquiry recommendations in full and without delay. And the Lord's Amendment number 2 would be a straightforward way for the government to fulfil that promise. It seeks to do 4 simple things. The owners of buildings that contain 2 or more sets of domestic premises could share information with their local fire and rescue service about the design and makeup of the external walls. They'd complete regular inspections of fire entrance doors. They'd complete regular inspections of lifts. They would share evacuation and fire safety instructions with residents. These measures are straightforward and are supported by key stakeholders. Indeed, a common response is some incredulity that these measures aren't already in law. The government has even tried to water down proposals on the evacuation of disabled people, reported today. They proposed requiring personal evacuation plans for disabled people only in buildings with known safety issues and a waking watch. It's only after legal action from the families of those who died in the Grenfell Tower fire that the government has relaunched a consultation on this. And the fire safety consultation includes proposals to check flat entrance doors every 6 months, when Sir Martin Morbick said all fire doors should be checked every 3 months. Ahead of setting up the Grenfell Tower inquiry, the then Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, said, "We cannot wait for ages to learn the immediate lessons." Nearly 4 years after Grenfell and over a year after the recommendations were published, we have waited ages. It is shameful that these things are not enshrined in law.
I wholeheartedly agree with the points my honourable friend is making, and I really wanted to emphasise to her the importance of the point in Section A about the sharing of the information about what the building is constructed of, because my constituents in Cardiff South and Parford have real difficulties in getting hold of, for example, architectural drawings or original as-built drawings, and there is simply no consistency in this across the UK, which means that fire and rescue services, let alone anybody trying to undertake works, have a much harder job.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I have had many similar cases in my constituency where people are just trying to get to the bottom of what the issues actually are, and while they can't get to the bottom of it, they are unable to sell their flat, they are facing fire remediation, waking watch charges, their insurance is rocketing, and they really have got lives on hold. And we heard from many of them this morning, and it really was very sad. It's very hard to understand why the government have put forward a disagreement motion to this amendment. I heard what the Minister said, but I do challenge him back and say he could have tried to amend our amendments if he had a problem with them, to make them work. And I think the answer that we will do these things but later is simply inadequate. We can't wait.
I think that we all as a House share the same objective. I certainly do. I want the recommendations of the first phase of the Grenfell inquiry implemented as quickly and as robustly as possible. I'm afraid, however, I think that you are trying to make a political point, because my right honourable friend has made very, very clear we have a robust system here. We've got the fire safety bill. We've already done the consultation on the fire safety orders. That will be coming out in the spring, and our methodology has been backed by the National Fire Chiefs Council, and the step-by-step process has also been backed by Dame Judith Hackett.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I don't doubt her sincerity in this and the work that she's done since she became a Member of Parliament. But I fundamentally disagree. The step-by-step process might be the right process, but it's so slow. So slow. We've had 4 years nearly since Grenfell, and we've had a year since these recommendations. The consultation finished in October. The government are still considering the responses to that consultation. It is painfully slow. And we have seen with COVID, have we not, what is possible when you put your mind to something, how tremendously quickly we have achieved amazing things through this year of trauma that we faced. And I think with the commitment, the government could work faster on this. Yeah.
I think we all share the frustration. We all want this done quickly, but it has to be done right. And if it comes down to a choice between quick and right, we owe it to the leaseholders to do it right.
I hear what the honourable member says, but I think, should we have a system in law where we check that the lift is safe? Is really not that complicated. These things are not that complicated. And of course there are experts, but throughout all stages of this bill, the government and the minister has referred to steering groups, task force, consultations, instead of actually implementing the recommendations, and we could have gone much faster. The government, as I said, published the consultation on fire safety in July. It closed in October. 4 months later, they're still analysing feedback. The government cannot keep making promises to act later. We need to act now. Madam Deputy Speaker, there really are no more excuses. There's no reason why this amendment couldn't be added to the bill. The Lords were right. Can I move now to Lords Amendment 4, to which there were many amendments tabled in attempts to improve it and build on it. This morning I heard from many leaseholders in this very situation. They told me of their desperation, how their lives have been put on hold, how they face mental health issues, how their insurance has rocketed, how their waking watch costs are exorbitant, how they can't get EWS forms so they can't sell their homes, how they face costs of other fire remediation way beyond cladding, how they live in blocks not covered by the government schemes, and many of them face bankruptcy. They simply cannot understand the injustice of having to pay for things that were never their fault. They cannot understand how the government doesn't get this and won't put it right. No.
Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. And to echo the comment from my Honourable friend, it is about getting this right rather than getting it done quickly. So does she not agree that actually a lot of these policies that we are bringing forward have been measured, have been accepted by experts, and are actually tackling the issue? And it is right that we actually tackle those most concerned of not being safe first, and then follow through afterwards, rather than trying to do all of them at the same time and getting it wrong.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. I struggle to understand genuinely why the government hasn't grasped the scale of this crisis and the quantity of people who cannot sell their flat, who cannot afford the costs that they are currently looking at, who cannot change jobs, who cannot get married, who cannot have children because their lives are on hold. These are many first-time buyers who have saved up, done, worked really hard and got their flat. If the government would say today, we will commit to legislate to say that leaseholders should not have to foot the bill, we could accept that there was a commitment there, but there isn't. There isn't a commitment to say leaseholders should not have to foot the bill. The words are said, but there's no action to put it into law. There is £5 billion, says the Minister from his seat, and that is true, but that doesn't cover a vast number of people who are still affected, a vast number of people whose lives are still on hold. And these are, you could say traditional, perhaps some of them conservative voters. They're people that, have... we struggle on this side of the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, to understand how the Treasury hasn't grasped the scale of this crisis and isn't putting it right.
In fact, I know for a fact that some of them are traditional Conservative voters, and I've spoken to people from all walks of life. They're in absolute anguish about this and leaving them in the dark. I mean, that announcement the other day, it was a very typical thing to announce a big sum of money and then not to be clear about how much of that was going to come to Wales, how the system was going to work, when it would come through, when the money would come through. These people have been living in the dark and in anguish for months and years, and it's completely unacceptable.
My honourable friend is completely right. I mean, the idea that you would have a loan, a long-term loan, where you pay £50 a month. If you need to pay £20,000, that loan stays with your building. You have no chance of selling your flat. Nobody is going to want to buy a flat with a bill that high.
What evidence has she got for that? I mean, this is a maximum charge per unit per month, £50. If she understands how property transactions work, that's a maximum of £600 a year. That capitalises to about £12,000. So I'm not saying it wouldn't affect the value of that property. It does not make them unsaleable. It makes them far more saleable. I draw the House's attention to my registered members' interest, Madam Deputy Speaker. It makes them far more saleable than they are today, and does actually affect the value by a relatively small amount.
The Honourable Member said, I'm not saying that this wouldn't affect the value of the property. That is the key. This should not be affecting the value of the property for people who have saved up for many years, worked hard, bought their flat through no fault of their own. Suddenly, the value of their property goes down because of the government failure to deal with the problem. Through successive lockdowns, Madam Deputy Speaker, the people in these blocks have gone to bed at night with the added pressure of sleeping in a building either at risk of fire or they are at risk of bankruptcy and deep financial trouble. It is taking a heavy toll on people's mental health, putting millions of lives on hold. Leaseholders have been trapped in this impossible position for far too long. Madam Deputy Speaker, I hate that we are still having this conversation. I hate that I have stood here at this dispatch box time after time for years saying the same thing to ministers, and I hate that there are good people on both sides of this House who are saying the same things, but it is still falling on deaf ears. The problem is not going to go away. The government could legislate today to make sure leaseholders do not pay by supporting the Lord's Amendment, by supporting McPartland-Smith Amendment, or by supporting the Labour amendments. At this point, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do not mind which one they would pick. I just want the job done.
One of the items that has been brought to my attention is that the 57% of flats requiring remediation were purchased for under £250,000, which means that for many of those people are living in negative equity in the properties that they have. Does the Honourable Lady agree that it's not about cake tomorrow, but what happens today? And unless government accepts the amendments that are coming forward, then those people have no hope, they feel, for the future.
Thank the member for his intervention. He's absolutely right. We heard from a lady this morning that the insurance cost for her small block had gone up from £30,000 a year to £500,000 a year insurance. We heard from a lady who lives in Kent, who lives in a block, and I know Honourable Member on the opposite side has stood up for her many, many, many times in this place, but they've spent £500,000 on Waking Watch already, £500,000. It is quite extraordinary. Madam Deputy Speaker, I was alarmed to see reports this afternoon that the Prime Minister's Press Secretary, Allegra Stratton, said, our problem with McPartland's amendment is that far from speeding things up for constituents across the country who are worried about finding themselves in these properties, they would actually slow things down. Mirrors the intervention that the Honourable Gentleman made earlier and is an absolute cop-out. We are 4 years on. Leaseholders are struggling. 11 million people, we think, are affected by this. 11 million people, not necessarily living in dangerous blocks, but living in blocks where they don't know quite because they haven't got the forms sorted, they're paying more insurance. 11 million people. There's a huge crisis. Yes, I would.
Would she agree with me that in the opposition day called by the Labour Party just a few weeks ago, I did say to the Minister, if our amendment is defective, then why don't you take it, fix it and make it work? They had the opportunity then. Do you think they should have done that?
I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman's intervention, and absolutely, he's right. Of course, if there was any problems with these amendments, they could have been addressed by government through this process. They've had 12 weeks between the Lords and coming here to try and affect some of these things, but have chosen not to. The amendments tabled by the members for Stevenage and Southampton are to prevent leaseholders from being billed for the fire safety repairs. Labour's amendments went further because the Partland Smith, supportive and good though they are, wouldn't cover leaseholders in blocks where flammable cladding had been added at some stage following the building of the block. So our amendments went further and would have included, for example, the Grenfell Tower, which was built in the 70s, but the flammable cladding was added later in 2017. In our amendments F, G, H and I to Lord's Amendment 4, we sought to go even further to make sure that the cost of fire safety problems from refurbishment jobs, like the cladding of the Grenfell Tower, cannot be passed on to leaseholders. And our amendments F and G ensure that leaseholders cannot be passed on the cost of remediating problems issued under the fire safety order wherever the problem was created. Labour's Amendment I would ensure that the bill protects leaseholders from the day it comes into law instead of an unknown date in the future. And Labour's Amendment H would have ensured that the fire safety order is extended in the future. The Secretary of State must publish an analysis of the financial implications for leaseholders, although this was not selected today and it was out of scope. Madam Deputy Speaker is hurrying me along, so I am turning pages so that I can speed up, which I will do, of course. To conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, Labour's amendments to the Fire Safety Bill are straightforward. They are based on issues that the government needs to address and have pledged to do so, but they haven't acted on. The risk of fire and looming bankruptcy will not wait while the government dithers and delays with inaction or failed proposals that keep many leaseholders in debt. Each amendment I have spoken to today corresponds to a broken promise from the government. Today is another chance for the government to finally put the public safety first and bring forward a set of legally binding commitments to deliver on the promises they made to leaseholders and to implement the recommendations of the Grenfell Phase 1 inquiry. Blameless victims of this crisis, who are in dangerous homes facing financial ruin, expect nothing less. As debates over the last 4 years have repeatedly shown, solving this issue fairly would command cross-party support, and today should be a day to deliver justice. It is not too late for the government to put the British public first and do the right thing. Thank you.